The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a righteous man, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her quietly. Such was his intention when, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home, for it is through the Holy Spirit that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took his wife into his home. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Have you noticed that in these incarnation narratives, this incredible role that the angels play in trying to work with the ordinary human beings encountered in the story? The angels came to Zechariah, they came to Mary, they came to Joseph, they came to the shepherds in the fields at night. And they have one unified and consistent message repeated over and over and over again. Do not be afraid. And it isn't simply in the Christmas stories either. Jesus himself tells us not to be afraid, even more than he tells us not to sin. Go through the gospel and read the sections where Jesus tells us not to sin, and then read the multitude of places where he tells us not to be afraid. Sin can be forgiven, but fear is rarely, if ever, confessed. I don't think in the confessional I've ever had someone come and say, "I let my fear drive me in the wrong direction." It is fear that the angels identify as the most important emotion to acknowledge, to understand, and to push through. Fear can be unconscious. I think we saw an example of it in today's gospel. I don't think Joseph knew when he decided to quietly divorce Mary that he was acting out of fear until he found out in the dream. Our subconscious can tell us so much. The angel tells him not to be afraid, and then he can make the right decision. Our greatest challenge is to confront our fears and to discern if that fear, is it real? Is it warranted in the situation? Or is it irrational? And is it going to push you in a bad direction? It's a spiritual task, a religious commandment. Do not be afraid. It's pretty difficult to misinterpret that commandment. Do not be afraid. Pope Francis speaks often of this in his homilies, and he speaks very strongly. He says, it is one of the temptations of the devil to make us afraid to do the right thing, even to make us afraid of God. The devil loves that, if you're afraid of God. Because fear is incompatible with love. How can you love what you are afraid of? Fear chokes out that emotion. In one of his homilies, Pope Francis said this. He said, each one of us has a small tomb, some area that has somewhat died within our hearts, a wound, a wrongdoing endured or inflicted, an unrelenting resentment, a regret that keeps coming back, or the fears that we cannot overcome. Let us not be held captive by the temptation to remain alone and discouraged, crying about what is happening to us. Let us not give in to the useless and inconclusive logic of fear, resignedly repeating that everything is going badly and nothing is as it once was. The Lord instead wishes to open the path of life, that encounter with him, to trust him in his heart, in your heart. So our spiritual task, perhaps, in the final week of Advent is through the crucible of prayer and sacraments to transform our fear into trust. It's hard work, which is why we avoid it. But it starts with a very simple question. All you have to do is ask yourself, what am I afraid of? It's a wonderful question. Do it in the safety of your room if you want to. But what are you afraid of? When I first started chaplaincy, I was a terrible chaplain. I would do these spiritual assessments like I'm checking off a grocery list of, do you go to Mass? Do you have family? That's blah, 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 blah. Until one time, I made a patient cry. She said, every day people come in my room, they ask me questions, and you're no different than any of them. And I was going to quit until I went to my CPE director, and she was a very wise person. I told her that I'm doing terrible and it's not working out. And she looks at me and she says, what are you afraid of? And I said, isn't it obvious? I'm afraid that I'm going to go in the room and have nothing to say. These people are suffering. They want to hear something. You have to give them a word of encouragement. She's like, no, you don't. She said, your homework for the next week is to push through that fear by going in every patient room and saying that you have nothing to say. Hi, I'm Chaplain Bob. I have nothing to say. How are you? And pull up a chair and listen. It was the best time of ministry in my life. What are you afraid of? As we enter the fourth week of Advent, surrounded by a cloud of angels to support us, we're called to abandon our fears, offer them to God, and trust.